Oh, it's getting worse. From Politico. New Hampshire Republicans feud over bid to knock Trump off 2024 ballot. The state GOP chair defended Trump's eligibility on Monday. We also have this from Friday. Florida lawyer files challenge to disqualify Trump from 2024 race, citing 14th Amendment. Now, that one hit Friday. We know it has begun. They're going to try and file all these legal challenges, say Trump can't be president. But this is new from Politico. Take a look at this. New Hampshire Republicans have erupted in a feud over a long shot effort to keep former President Donald Trump off the ballot in 2024, with the chair of the state GOP insisting Monday that the front runner for the party's nomination will be included. In New Hampshire and elsewhere, some legal scholars and Trump critics have long argued the former president should be disqualified from the ballot under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars those who've taken an oath to support the Constitution from holding office again if they've, quote, engaged in insurrection against the United States or given aid or comfort to its enemies. But the dispute is taking off in New Hampshire, where Bryant Corky Messner, an attorney who ran on Trump's endorsement and Senate nominee, blah, 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 is questioning Trump's eligibility for the ballot. I'm a constitutional conservative. The words say what they say. I quite frankly believe it is in Donald Trump's best interest to get this looked at as quickly as possible. In any effort to keep Trump off the ballot will face a steep climb, blah, blah, blah. We get it. But here we go, ladies and gentlemen. State by state, it's not even 2024, and they're already trying to remove his name from the ballot. If even a single state removes Trump's name from the ballot, you will have 75 million people at the bare minimum saying we never had an election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that. I'm sure you would say that.
Absolutely. I mean, the 75 million people who voted for him last time around, I can't imagine that they would consider it a free and fair election if Trump's name is taken off a single state. Florida, especially. If Trump's name's off in Florida, he can't win.
No.
Especially prior to a conviction, right? Like he's being found not guilty, being found guilty before a conviction. And I also think that's why they're trying to push these things forward. Is they're not just looking at the gagging him or the political consequences of it. They're looking at trying to convict him so that he doesn't even qualify to run for president.
But criminal conviction doesn't matter because the lawsuit citing the 14th Amendment is a civil matter. It's a political matter. So the question is, does a judge think Trump waged insurrection? We're not here to, the judge is going to say the question laid before the court is not whether or not Trump committed a crime, but whether or not he waged insurrection. Based on the evidence from the January 6th committee, media report,
right.
video, it seems clear. The judge says yes. That's it. And then it'll get appealed. Here's the crazy part. Let's just say it's December 12th and it finally goes to the Supreme Court. It's rapidly pushed through and they say, we reject this. You cannot remove Trump's name from the ballot. Well, the election was a month ago.
Right.
Have
yeah,
a nice
that's
day.
a concern.
Yeah.
It's interesting, too, because, and I'm sure you've seen it, the stories out from the Atlantic, New York Times, NPR, whoever else, saying that Trump should be off the ballot, that they should use this 14th Amendment. And then I was listening to a podcast, like an NPR podcast, because I'm always interested to hear
what they say,
and I'll be like, that's not what happened. But I'm always interested to hear it. And they were saying that secretaries of state for each state and attorneys general, they could make the decision themselves that Trump was guilty of an insurrection and pull his name off the ballot. And they were sort of encouraging people to do that. I will say, though, that for the New Hampshire thing, the New Hampshire GOP chair was on Charlie Kirk today and was saying that he talked with the Secretary of State and Attorney General and doesn't think the move against Trump on the ballot is going to happen. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen in other states. And certainly a lot of Democrats are saying that attorneys general have the power to do that. What I don't understand is why states...
Wait, unilaterally?
What?
The attorney general can unilaterally just say we take Trump off?
That's what they were saying on this podcast I was listening to today, was that that the attorneys general could say he's guilty of an insurrection, that could then be appealed. But by that point, like you were saying, if he's already off the ballot, then the election interference has already happened.
Right. It's already happened.
You have to then encourage a pencil campaign, which I'm totally bringing a pencil to.
It won't work. I mean, it's going to be an October surprise.
Right. Something's going to happen.
They want the legal challenge to go through after the election.
After the election,
Mm-hmm. That's right.
They do it in October. Early voting and mail-in voting is happening, and there's no Trump on some of these ballots. And you know what? It's entirely possible, based on what we saw in 2020, with the executive unilateral changes to the election rules and things like that. Things like in Pennsylvania, where they did universal mail-in voting in violation of their own constitution. A lower court judge said, "Yep." Then the Supreme Court goes, nah, it's probably fine. Even though any reasonable person can be like, yeah, your constitution says you can't do this, but they don't care. They're going to do whatever they want. I wouldn't be surprised if come October, they just, as you mentioned, attorneys general just take Trump's name off and say, there is no question. Everyone knows he waged insurrection. We've been talking about it for years.
Using that exact word,
Yes.
insurrection, yeah.
And
And
then
you have to use that word.
right,
Yeah.
because they've been saying insurrection specifically because of the
14th
Constitution.
Amendment, yeah.
And then what happens is they say, if you have a problem with it, sue me. And everyone does. And then the election's over. And they say, what's the big deal? We had an election.
It's like with COVID when in New York State, Governor Cuomo shut down all the churches and a suit was brought and it ended up getting an emergency hearing before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't shut down the churches. But that was months and months and months later. And by that point, like most of the people had stopped going to church altogether.
And Cuomo said, okay, we'll get rid of it. And then he did another one in a slightly different way that did the same thing.
So that it could then be challenged again and months later be ruled to,
Look, you know.
And I don't think they brought a challenge at
got
that
it.
point. I think they were out of cash.
I got to tell you.
I don't know.
When people start to realize that the courts have no enforcement power, everything's going to start breaking down. Because it's an interesting thing, right? The executive branch has its enforcement power. The judicial, the legislative branch has subpoena power, and they can make criminal referrals. It's a bit weaker. The executive branch is obviously where most of the power is, almost all of it. But the courts, what can they do other than bang the gavel and say, do it? And of course, you know, courts have some degree of enforcement, but it's minimal. If a court says something and no one abides by it, what do? I tell this people when it comes to private matters too. Like, you know, it's the old saying, a person can be judgment proof, or you can't get blood, you can't squeeze blood from a turnip. I'm like, if you win a suit against someone, like look at Alex Jones, right? They sue him for, what is it, like the entire GDP of France? Like, no, that's what they requested. I think they won like $1 billion. I'm like, you're not going to get a penny out of him because you get in line behind all of his other creditors.
Yeah.
It's just, you can't just make these things happen. There's no guarantees.
Also, they're
So-
ensuring that he stays on the air because he's going to need to stay on the air in order to earn money to pay them back.
Oh, that's funny too. Yeah, unless I think they said they want to destroy him. But here's my concern. This is what I was thinking about over this past week. We saw the Chaz, the Chop, the George Floyd autonomous zone. We saw the Atlanta autonomous zone. These things popped up. We saw random acts of violence. And now you have, on top of the political violence, a story we'll get to in a minute, a GOP lawyer, we don't know what happened, was killed in his home. He was stabbed to death. Maybe political, maybe not, but we'll talk about that. But with the escalation of political violence that we've been seeing, to the point where Stephen Marsh, who wrote the book The Next Civil War, says we're in civil strife, I had a lingering thought about these autonomous zones. It's funny to me that, so I was trending earlier on Twitter because, you know, I guess.
In your own category, right?
And in my own category too.
yes, the
which
Tim
is,
Pool category.
yeah, that's right. Tim Pool was trending Tim Pool. And it was people were talking about Civil War. It's like, oh, I said it to drink. And I'm like, it's really interesting. You know, honest question. If I were to tell you that, say, like a president claimed the election was completely fraudulent, large amounts of his supporters were claiming that he's the true president and Biden's illegitimate. There had been a dispute over who actually won the election in the previous election cycle as well. And then you ended up with a bunch of people storming into the Capitol and fighting with police in front. You also had a roving band of 100 plus far left extremists storm onto government property in Georgia. And in one instance, get into a shootout with police, shooting a cop, and then the cops shoot back, killing one of the extremists. You have far left extremists being arrested and charged overtly with domestic terror. I'm like, at what point do you say, maybe, yeah, civil war, right? My point is this. All of that stuff, it's almost like you got to keep reminding people that, hey, this stuff happened. I don't know where it goes from here, but yeah, far left extremists took over a government site in Georgia and opened fire on police. After torching several homes in the area, the police came in and returned fire. A cop was struck and one of the extremists was killed. Like, yo, it's getting crazy, all right?
Yeah, that is crazy.
Now imagine this scenario. This is what got me worried. Chaz and the George Floyd Autonomous Zone were on public property. The Atlanta Autonomous Zone was on a Wendy's, but the Wendy's was burnt to the ground. And then everyone kind of abandoned the area. So we have this these different circumstances. What happens if far left extremists occupy a piece of private land? Let's say in Georgia or Tennessee or something. Slightly more conservative leaning area near an urban environment. They occupy, to set up their autonomous zone on a derelict piece of private property. The person who owns that property then goes to the police and says, get these whack jobs off my property. And the police say, we have no capability to do that. Like we saw with Chaz and with George Floyd and Atlanta, the police backed down and were like, we're not getting involved. But what happens when a private owner or corporation says, if the police won't do something about it, I will?
Well, you saw there was a guy in Atlanta who was a landlord. He owned a home. He was renting it out. Tenants moved out. A couple days later, he went to check on the home, and he was met with a guy with a shotgun, a bunch of dogs, and some prostitutes. And he was like, "Oh, why are these people in my house?" He was like, "You got to get out of my house." The people in the house, the squatters, called the police, said that it was their home.
Yep.
The police got the guy, carted off. It's 6 months later. He's still waiting for the people to get out of his house. He's still paying the mortgage. And he's stuck. He doesn't have a property. He doesn't have any rights, apparently. There was also, the other thing, too, is like it depends on where the government is. Do you remember the MOVE organization in Philadelphia?
Yeah.
And they were bombed, actually, by the city.
Yep.
But this was a group of black nationalists who had taken over a little area in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia. They had purchased a property in Virginia, and they were planning to move to Virginia, get out of the city. And there was a shooting of an officer, Officer Ramp. I think it was in 79. And a bunch of people, like 9 people, ended up getting arrested and put in prison for that. They were called the Move 9. And so they decided to stay. And by staying, what ended up happening is the mayor of Philadelphia, who was a black mayor, is it Wilson Good? Am I remembering that correctly? I don't know. Anyway, he coordinated with the FBI and bombed.
They firebombed it.
They firebombed it.
Yeah,
and as
bombs.
people were trying to run out, they shot them.
Yep. It was like Waco at a neighborhood level.
Right.
Yeah. And it was a
Right
response to a legitimate issue,
Right.
but they basically declared war on the neighborhood.
Yep.
And they burned down houses,
Yep.
like not just the MOVE compound, but they burned down houses in the area as well.
Yep.
That's when the government was more had a stronger monopoly on their violence.
But the government was in control of the violence at that point, and that's not the same now.
Right. And so now my concern is what happens if another Chaz happens, but it happens on like abandoned property. Not even abandoned, derelict is a better way to put it. Like someone owns it and they're like, let's say a corporation. Nordstrom just shut down in San Francisco, which is like a big deal.
That is a big deal.
The mall is still owned, right? I think the building was forfeited by by Westfield to the bank. So, okay, let's say a large corporation owns 3 acres of land somewhere, and the far left decides we're going to take it, and no one can stop us. Cops aren't going to go engage in a shootout.
No.
They're going to ignore it.
Not in an abandoned mall.
Not even an abandoned mall. Like, let's imagine it's just like an old warehouse building that's not being used, but it's still on the books for some big corporation or moderately sized let's say like medium local or like corporation in a city that's got like a few board members and maybe a couple hundred employees. So it's small enough, but big enough. The far left decides we're going to take it because it's not being used. It's got broken windows and graffitied all over. But the people who own it are still keeping track of it. And then what happens when the police are like,
We're not going to do anything.
it's not on
about it.
city property. We're not going to get involved.
This is why the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms for self-defense is so important. Like we see over and over again with Chaz and with Chop, with Uvalde and with Parkland, like when the police have mandated that everyone is vulnerable to violence and that, they're the monopoly on violence, they very often like kind of hang back. And in a way, you almost can't blame them because they also want to get home to their families, but they were holding back parents that were trying to get in there.
Right.
In Uvalde, the guy who actually went in to kill the Uvalde shooter, he was an off-duty Border Patrol agent who ignored their orders not to
That's
go
right.
in there.
That
and
was
this,
the most horrifying story.
it's horrific. And the case you were talking about, the man in Atlanta, he was trespassed.
Right.
He was actually arrested
That's
until they
right.
realized he was the property owner. It's at some point, people need to realize you are your own first responder. All the old cliche stuff our parents said about when seconds count, the police are minutes away. They're minutes away to possibly hold you back as people victimize you. And so we really need to understand just how paramount the right to self-defense is.
It's sort of terrifying. I mean, I have like tried to avoid interactions with police my entire life. Like when I was a kid, at one point there were police in my house, and I was like, I'm not going to repeat this. This is never happening again.
Yeah.
But it's like it's very scary when you come into contact with police because they show up and they think everybody is the enemy.
Head on a swivel, yeah.
You know,
Well, yeah, they
that's
don't
what they
wanna-
do.
I mean, well, think about it this way.
Remember they killed that Australian lady?
There was so you guys saw that video where the was it like Extinction Rebellion people or whatever have the
Nevada?
barricades in is that by Burning Man?
Yeah, it was all the people trying to get to Burning Man and the climate activists.
We're blocking the road. Well, the cops apparently got a call that someone had a gun. I guess what happened was someone told the police, you need to get down here and clear this barricade before someone shoots one of these protesters, something like that. Then what happens is the dispatcher says to the police, there's concerns about a potential shooting. We've got protesters.
Yeah.
So then the cops think these protesters have guns. And when the cop rams the barricade and jumps out with his gun, he says, "Where's the gun?" several times, something like that. I think that, I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong. But think about it from the perspective of a cop. All you know is you got a call from dispatch saying 2 people are fighting inside this house. It's getting ugly. We need someone to come and shut this down. And then you show up and there's a group of people in the house being like, "Get out of our house." And some guy being like, "It's my house." Like, what do they do?
Yeah. The Nevada thing
they
was
typically do
amazing.
is say, "Civil matter, have a nice day."
Right, like the Tracy Chapman song. The Nevada thing was absolutely amazing, though, because you had climate activists blocking the road. You had Burning Man people trying to get through the road, and then you had tribal police show up to clear the road. So the climate change people think they're on the side of the tribal police. They think that they're on the same side as them. The Burning Man people think they're on the side of the climate change people, but it turns out they're not. Meanwhile, the tribal police are the ones who get they have all the oppression points. So they're the ones who get to win. And then they show up as a bunch of guys in trucks with guns.
Well,
it was just fascinating to
You
watch.
did have a bunch of upper middle class white people occupying native land.
Right, and that's one thing they said. You're trespassing on tribal land. It's one thing the cops said to these people.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. Hang out with us live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. and become a member over at timcast.com for uncensored, members-only shows exclusive. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.